In the wider Islamic world during the Middle Ages, there of course existed many groups of non-Muslim religious adherents. In fact, even though the Arab conquest took place in the 7th century, the Islamic world remained majority non-Muslim for centuries afterwards, for as long as up until the turn of the first millennium. And among this variety of communities, there were of course Christians of various denominations, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and Manichaeans, among others. But one of the most mysterious and interesting has to be the so-called Sabians of Harran, or the Haranians, a group of people who seems to have existed for a long time into the far ancient past, but who also produced some of the most celebrated and significant scholars in the so-called Islamic Golden Age. So who are or were the Sabians of Harran? Before we start, I just want to remind you quickly that I just released a new song with my band Zini. It's called Tasting. You can find it on my other YouTube channel, Philip Palm. There's a video version there. You can also find it on all streaming platforms or wherever you find your music. It should be there. If you like alternative rock with influences from Middle Eastern music, then go check that out. Thank you so much. The term Sabian, or sometimes Sabian, is a contested and mysterious one, and there have been many debates regarding its meaning. It originates in the Qur'an, which talks about the so-called Sabi'un in various surahs alongside Christians and Jews as legitimate religions, perhaps even among the so-called people of the book, or the Ahl al-Kitab. For example, in Surah al-Baqarah it says, "Indeed, the believers, Jews, Christians, and Sabians, Sabi'un, whoever truly believes in God and the last day and does good will have their reward with their Lord, and there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve." The problem is, no one really knows who these Sabi'un are. Even the earliest tafsirs or commentaries of the Qur'an make it clear that they were unsure of what this term was supposed to refer to. Some of the early Muslim writers argue that they were everything from a certain sect of Christianity to a completely independent religion that was similar to Christianity and Judaism and sometimes Zoroastrianism. And some even claim that they might have been just, that the Sabi'un is simply a term referring to the followers of Muhammad, the converts to Islam at the time of the Prophet. So there are many different theories. Now, I recently made an episode dedicated precisely to discussing what the Quranic term Sabi'un means and the different theories about who they might have been and which groups were argued to be the Sabians across history and so on. So you can check that out before watching this one. But by the 10th century or so, the debate seems to have settled among scholars that the Sabi'a, which is the name that they had started to use by that time, was one of a number of religious communities that existed in the region at the time. And two groups were especially chosen as being the Sabians. The Mandaeans, who are a quote-unquote Gnostic religion mainly active in southern Mesopotamia/Iraq and is still one of the most popular. But the other group that was often identified as the Sabians from the 9th century or so, and who seem to have also identified themselves as Sabians, is the fascinating community in the city of Haran in northern Syria. This is what is today modern Turkey. The Haranians had a really unique religion of their own that was referred to by Muslim and other writers at the time, outsiders, as star worship. That's how it was characterized. But which also might go back to ancient Mesopotamian religion, to Neoplatonism, and maybe even Hermeticism. And this group, the Haranians, the Sabians of Harran, is the group that we'll be focusing on today. Haran is a very ancient city, one that has played an important role for thousands of years. In ancient times, the city was part of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, thus being part of the wider Mesopotamian civilization and cultural sphere. And it wasn't really a location on the fringes of society either. Indeed, Haran was the location of a major temple for the moon god Sin, and was thus a vibrant location full of cultural and religious activity, one that many different people would travel to in order to visit the temple primarily. And this is apparent later on in history as well, during antiquity, when it is reported that figures like the Roman Emperor Julian stopped by the city specifically to consult the moon god in the temple there. The Bible even mentions Haran as a city that Abraham and his family stopped by on their journey to Canaan, which has also given it a place in the sacred history of the Abrahamic religions. In short, we can say thus that Haran was a city that would have followed the polytheistic Mesopotamian religion with all that entailed. But what's so interesting about this particular religious and cultural tradition of Haran is that they seem to have been very persistent. They survived even after the fall of the Mesopotamian civilization, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, into the Roman and Hellenic times, which maybe isn't that surprising because, the religious system of the Hellenic world wasn't all that different from the Mesopotamian one. At least it wouldn't have necessarily naturally clashed. But even with the rise of monotheism in late antiquity, first with Christianity and the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire, and then of course after the arrival of Islam with the Arab conquest, the Haranians still persisted in their way of life and in their old religion, which is quite unique, right? It's clear that this was the case, and we don't really find many other, if any, cities like that or places in that part of the world that persisted so much in their religious tradition, even when basically everyone around them, all their neighbors, and even people in the city itself, had changed to the new religious movements that had been appearing. So this makes Haran very unique historically. So what do we actually know about them then, about their religion and philosophy and so on? Well, sadly, not much at all. Most of our sources come from the Arab and Muslim writers who would sometimes catalog and describe different religious minorities in the region. And indeed, quite early on in the Islamic period, the Haranians came to be identified as the Quranic Sabiun, or the Sabians. How this happened is a little unsure, but it is likely that the fact that even the earliest Muslim scholars didn't know for sure who the Sabiun were meant that the term was essentially up for grabs. Here was a group mentioned in the Qur'an alongside Christians and Jews as legitimate religions that no one knew who they actually were. And as we explored in my previous episode about the term and the theory surrounding it, this meant that Muslims started to identify different groups as Sabians, and perhaps more importantly, that certain groups in the region started to identify themselves as the Sabians. Because, as we said, if you are Sabians, that means that you, alongside with Christians and Jews, are guaranteed religious freedom of practicing a religion and so on, and theoretically equality in society as long as you pay a poll tax called the jizya. And this seems to have been what happened to the Haranians. In fact, there's a story told about how this supposedly happened. This is a story that involves the great famous Caliph al-Ma'mun, the Abbasid Caliph, a son to Harun al-Rashid, who lived, and this is supposed to happen sometime in the 830s. And this is an account that is retold in the Fihrist by Ibn al-Nadim, which is a source that's going to be coming back. We're going to be using it a lot and discussing it a lot in this episode. But in that account, which is taken from a Christian writer who supposedly lived like 70 years or so after the event, so we should take all this with a huge grain of salt, needless to say. But the story goes like this, that al-Ma'mun was visiting Haran. He was visiting, or he was standing at the gates of Haran, and he noticed that the people in this region, this city, they dressed differently, they acted differently, they were strange to him, they were unfamiliar. So he asked them, who are you? Like, what religion do you belong to? And because, of course, they weren't Muslim, they weren't Christian, they weren't Jews, they had their own tradition that they'd been following, they simply said, we are Haranians. Al-Ma'mun wasn't satisfied with this answer, so he sort of asked follow-up questions. Do you follow the prophets? Do you have prophets? Do you have a sacred scripture, perhaps? And the Haranians didn't really give any satisfactory answer. They kind of answered vaguely. And so as a response to this, al-Ma'mun said, very harshly, I'm now going on a campaign into Byzantine territory. I'm on my way on to that right now. When I come back from that campaign, you guys better be Muslims or Christians or Jews, or anything that I recognize as a legitimate religion, or I'm going to kill you all. Now, obviously, this was a stressful situation to the Haranians, we have to imagine, and they were kind of distraught over what should we do? We don't want to convert, but also we don't want to be killed, obviously. So what do we do? So the story goes that they then went to a Muslim judge or jurist, a qadi or faqih, and asked him what they should do about this. And the judge then showed them this part in the Qur'an that we have quoted, where it talks about the Sabians and Christians and Jews, and said, just say you're Sabians, and you'll be fine. And that is what they did. They said, we're the Sabians, and thus they escaped the wrath of the caliph and could live comfortably within Islamic law, so to say, and were given freedom of religion and so on. This is a very fanciful story. It's not likely to be entirely true, but I think it is true, in my opinion, in the broad sense of what happened. Maybe not the details of what happened, but I think it's true. It's giving us true information in the sense that this is probably how the Sabians or the Haranians came to adopt the term Sabian, because being known as Sabian gave people more legitimacy, because they would be considered one of those legitimate religions mentioned in the Qur'an. So most likely the Sabians saw this opportunity to simply identify as this Quranic group and thereby be given all these freedoms within Islamic law. So basically, for many Muslim and Arab writers from that time onwards, the Haranians were the Sabians of Harran, and they would actually come to play a pretty significant role. But what then were the actual beliefs and practices of these Haranians or Sabians? There are many mentions of them in different Muslim and Arab texts. Most of them don't give us much in terms of substance, and when it does, there are several reasons to be somewhat skeptical. But the recurring theme or claim that we see all over our sources is that they are supposedly star worshippers, or that they worship the heavenly bodies. Now, this could, of course, mean many different things, but if we consider the fact that they appear to have been a kind of continuation of old Babylonian or Mesopotamian religious practice, it does kind of make sense. Indeed, Mesopotamia, the Assyrians and Babylonians, were famous in antiquity precisely, partly at least, because of the strong astronomical and astrological tradition that they were associated with. The heavenly bodies had always played an important role in their religious tradition and theology. The stars and planets in the sky were seen as physical representations of the gods, the deities that resided beyond the heavens. So the planets were not actually literally seen as the gods, but as representations of these gods. But there are also indications that by the end of that civilization, so during the course of the first millennium BC, the emphasis on the heavenly bodies as divine in themselves had become maybe a bit more prominent. And of course, we know that many of the gods were directly associated with planets and stars, whether directly or in terms of representation, such as Shamash, the sun, and the aforementioned Sin, which was the god of the moon. Having a remnant of this Mesopotamian religion survive in Harran into late antiquity, it makes sense that they would have placed an emphasis on the heavens and the heavenly bodies in their worship. Obviously, as with all religions, this one would have also changed and evolved over time, right? So that the Haranian religion as it existed in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries would have obviously been different in many ways from the way it was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia, for instance. This is the case for all religions. But if there is a recurring theme that we find in most of those sources, it is precisely this idea of the importance of the stars and the heavenly bodies. For example, in the surviving writings of a Christian bishop of Harran in the early 9th century by the name Theodore Abou-Qurra, we get a description of some of their beliefs. He says, quote, "They claimed that they worshipped the 7 planets, the sun, the moon, Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, and the 12 zodiacal houses, because they are the ones that create and govern this creation and give good fortune and prosperity in the lower world and ill fortune and suffering. They said that their prophet in that is Hermes the sage." Now, that last part about Hermes is of course really interesting, but we'll return to that soon, because this seems to be a pretty clear indication of the prominent stars in their religion. But you might ask, this is a Christian writer who is critical of them and considers them heretical, so can we really trust his description? Well, that's a fair point, but if we look at other sources from around the same time, and from other people entirely from different cultures and religions, we get very similar descriptions. One of the best and most extensive sources that we have come from the so-called Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, a massive catalog of books and descriptions of sects, people, philosophers, and stories from the Islamic world in the 10th century. And in this catalog, Ibn al-Nadim has collected a few different accounts about the Sabians. One of them is told by the famous Arab philosopher al-Kindi, although through a student of his called al-Sarakhsi. And we're going to be looking at this text quite extensively in this episode. Here's a section from that text which also indicates the importance of animal sacrifice for this religious tradition. Quote, "They have offerings with slaughtering which they offer to the planets. Some of them say that if the offering is made in the name of the Creator, it is an indication that it is bad, because according to them, this is turning to the great power who leaves that which is beneath him to those whom he has formed for mediating in the management of things. The things which they sacrifice for the offerings are made of cattle, sheep, goats, and other four-legged beasts which do not have teeth in both of the two jaws, with the exception of the camel. They also sacrifice birds which do not have talons, with the exception of the pigeon." End quote. Even much later in history, in the writings of the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides, we get mentions of the Sabians. He seems to identify the term Sabian more widely as pagans in general, but his description in the Guide for the Perplexed suggests that he is talking about the Haranians in particular, of which he says, quote, "Our father Abraham, as we know, grew up among the Sabians, whose doctrine is that there is no God but the stars. Once I have informed you in this chapter of their books extant today in Arabic translation and of their ancient chronicles, and have disclosed their teachings and traditions to you. You'll see how they avow the star's divinity, with the sun as the supreme deity. All 7 planets were gods, they held, but the 2 luminaries were the greatest. They professed, as you will find, that the sun rules the world above and here below." The fact that this characteristic or aspect of venerating the heavenly bodies is so recurring in different sources from different times and places and from people of different cultural and religious backgrounds seems to suggest to us that there must be something to it, right? And this might also be indicated by the works and careers of some of those great scholars, philosophers, and scientists who made a name for themselves in the intellectual sphere of the Islamic world, particularly in Baghdad, and who were from the city of Haran. You see, much of what we know and what the Arabs knew at the time about the Haranians were filtered through certain prominent and famous figures from the community. During the Abbasid Caliphate and what is sometimes referred to as the quote-unquote golden age of Islam, with its scholarly environment, families and individuals from Haran actually moved to the capital Baghdad, and a few of them actually made quite a career for themselves there. The most famous of these Haranians is a man called Thabit ibn Qurra, a court physician, mathematician, astronomer, and all-around polymath of the late 9th and early 10th centuries. He was born in Haran in the year 836, and according to Ibn al-Nadim's account, he worked as a money changer in that city before becoming acquainted with Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, the famous mathematician. Thabit moved to Baghdad and studied with al-Khwarizmi and soon became a renowned scholar himself, especially within the fields of astronomy and mathematics. And these two fields were basically seen as synonymous with each other at that time. He also became quite close to the Abbasid court, working there as the court physician. Ibn al-Nadim says, quote, "He, that is Muhammad ibn Musa, gave him his patronage, presenting him to al-Mu'tadid and associating him with a group of astronomers. The source of the leadership of the Sabians in this country and their proximity to the Caliph was Thabit ibn Qurra. Their status, moreover, became established, their ranks became elevated, and they displayed superiority." End quote. He was, in other words, a very popular and successful scholar and scientist in Baghdad at that time, and thus came to represent the Haranians to a wider audience. He wrote many works on different topics, including works supposedly describing the religion and philosophy of the Haranians, including one called The Laws of Hermes and the Prayers that the Sabians use, none of which survives today, sadly. We only have access to fragments of his more scientific works. But the point is it a coincidence that a person who comes from a culture and religious tradition that supposedly has star worship and the heavenly bodies as an essential part of their faith and practice would also go on to become a prominent astronomer/astrologer in Abbasid Baghdad? Many will indeed say no, and point to Thabit's philosophical scientific work as a kind of extension of his native culture. At the same time, as we'll talk about more later on, much of the information that the contemporaries had on the Haranians became filtered through people like Thabit, which poses a bit of a problem in itself, right? So maybe we are projecting Thabit's ideas and philosophy onto the Haranians. That's also a possibility. Basically, it could indeed be another indication of the importance of astrology to the Haranians at that time. But what it actually means and how it was understood by the Haranians themselves is a lot harder to say, since we don't have any of their surviving writings, at least writings that describe their religion. Were they actually worshipping the stars, or was it more complicated than that? Some of the sources that we have looked at, such as the Christian Theodor Abu Qurra, seem to highlight the planets as the primary objects of worship. But other sources indicate a different picture, where the Haranians claim to have believed in a unified, all-powerful God in a kind of monotheistic way, and that the planets and the heavenly bodies are simply mediaries between this God and the world down here. In that account by al-Kindi, mediated by al-Sarakhsi and quoted by Ibn al-Nadim, we get this pretty comprehensive description. Quote, "These people, the Haranian Sabians, agree that the world has a prime cause, the transcendent deity, who is eternal and a unity rather than multiple. No attribute of things created is connected with him. He has charged discerning persons who he has created to acknowledge his lordship. He has shown them the way, sending apostles for their guidance and for confirmation of proof, ordering them both to call people to be approved by him and to warn them of his anger. They, the apostles, have promised enduring contentment for the obedient, but for the person who is disobedient, they have promised torment and punishment to the extent which he deserves. Eventually, however, this punishment will be ended. It is related that one of their leaders said, 'God punishes for 9,000 cycles, after which there will be a change to the compassion of God.' These people who summon to God and the true religion by which they make vows are regarded in a special way. Their famous and eminent personalities are Arani, Agatha-daimon, and Hermes, so Hermes. Some of them also mention Solon, the ancestor of the philosopher Plato, on his mother's side. The doctrine of all these people is the same. Their statutes and laws are not contradictory. They have adopted one direction for prayer, which they have fixed toward the North Star in its course. The intelligent thus seek to inquire for wisdom. They have resisted whatever disagrees with this point of view." End quote. The section goes on for quite a while after this, but we already get a pretty interesting picture. They believe in an eternal and unified God or prime cause who has sent prophets and who threatens people with judgment. To get some complementary information, we can also return to the previous quote from al-Kindi's section, which talks about the planets and stars precisely as intermediaries. Quote, "They have offerings with slaughtering which they offer to the planets. Some of them say that if the offering is made in the name of the Creator, it is an indication that it is bad, because according to them, this is turning to the great power, who leaves that which is beneath him to those whom he has formed for mediating in the management of things." So if this account is to be believed, there is a unified Creator God, but the prayers and offerings given by the Haranians are directed at the planets, because they are carrying out the will of God. And this view seems to have also been supported or claimed by some Haranian scholars themselves at that time. Now, this isn't all that different, except for the praying to the planets part, from the standard astronomical picture adopted by Muslims at this time as well. They would also see the planets as instruments through which God carried out his will on earth. They are causative in a sense, but only insofar as they are instruments of the ultimate causer, God. So this cosmology isn't all that unique, even in the Muslim environment. And this is precisely the problem. how much can we actually trust al-Kindi's account here? What is his source of information? It becomes a little suspicious that, as we continue reading, if that wasn't already clear, the picture al-Kindi paints of the Sabians is very similar to Islam in several ways. Not only are they monotheistic and have prophets, they also pray daily. There's 3 prayers a day according to this account. And they do this prayer through prostrations, just like Muslims. They have yearly fasts of 30 days that end with an Eid celebration. They have dietary laws similar to Muslims, where they avoid eating pork, for instance. Being a fan of Aristotle, al-Kindi is also at pains to argue that their doctrines are completely in line with the philosophy of Aristotle, which one can, of course, question. So what's going on here? It seems that al-Kindi is describing the Haranian religion in very Islamic ways, right? But why would he do this? I mean, there are different ways we can try to understand that. Maybe he is trying to explain this religion or this people to an audience that aren't very familiar with it. So he is describing them in very Muslim adjacent ways for his audience to better understand what he's saying because of associations and so on. That's a possibility. Or maybe he's simply trying to present them in a positive light in some way. Maybe he likes them, he's influenced by them, so he has their best interests in mind. I don't know, that is possible. A third option, which maybe is more likely, is that al-Kindi might be working from actual Haranian sources, that he's getting this from Haranians themselves, but that the Haranians presented themselves to a Muslim audience in Muslim ways, to better fit in, to be more widely accepted. If they present themselves as very close to Islam, that would sort of support this campaign or this idea of arguing that they are among the people of the book or the protected religions. They have the same prophets and so on. And that al-Kindi might be retelling these accounts from Sabians themselves who present their tradition in Islamic terms. Or maybe this is all accurate. This could be the case. As we said, every religion always changes and adapts to new context and new circumstances, and not just in ways that, in order to assimilate or to survive and so on, but legitimately because of a new context and circumstance, people will renegotiate the way that they themselves understand themselves and their religion. So it's very possible that the Haranians, because of influence from the other religions and cultures around them, also developed and changed the way that they saw their own religion, so that the accounts that al-Kindi might be retelling here are accurately what the Haranians believed themselves, right? So all these options are possible, but it's hard to say anything with any certainty. If anything, it makes it quite clear that a very sort of blatant label like star worshippers is probably oversimplifying things. I think we can be quite sure in arguing for that. But we also see that there's a lot to that description as well. But I think that's what the conclusion of this little rant and section is that it's complicated. But another aspect that is very interesting and seems to have been very important is the frequent mention of Hermes as an important figure for the Haranians. Now this is of course Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical ancient sage that was a kind of combination between the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, but became this whole other kind of figure, the originator of occult knowledge and esoteric learning and writing and so on, associated with this tradition called Hermeticism or Hermetism, and writings called the Hermetica. So this is the Hermes that we're talking about here. If we return again to Theodore Abou-Qurra, he of course said they worship the 7 planets, the sun, the moon, Saturn, Mars, etc. And then at the end he says, they said that their prophet in that is Hermes, the sage. And if you remember, al-Kindi also claimed a similar thing in the above quote, saying, quote, their famous and eminent personalities are Arani or Urani, Agatha Daimon, and Hermes. And this would indeed be one of the most characteristic things about the Sabians of Harran, that Hermes was an important figure or even a prophet for them. Many of the later Muslim writers even seem to indicate that Hermes was the prophet for the Haranians, just as Muhammad was the prophet for Muslims, or maybe Moses was the prophet associated with Judaism. And this has led to a lot of speculation even today about the hermetic character of the Haranians. Were the Haranians a brotherhood of Hermetists? And if they were, was this the source for much of the Hermetic knowledge and learning, philosophy, entering into the Islamic intellectual sphere? Well, there is little to no evidence supporting this if we understand Hermetist as specifically following the intellectual, philosophical, spiritual tradition associated with the philosophical Hermetica as such. Now, for sure, all evidence points to the idea that Hermes was indeed an important figure for the Haranians, as were many of the ancient sages and philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato. This was seen as a kind of ancient lineage that stretched back into far back into ancient times. So they saw people like Pythagoras and the Pythagorean tradition and Plato and so on as their kind of philosophical forebears. And one interesting thing that points to this lineage is that when Al-Kindi describes their dietary laws, he mentions that, quote, "Among the birds they have forbidden eating the pigeon and such as have talons, and among the plants the fava beans and garlic. Some of them go further, forbidding green beans, cauliflower, cabbage, and lentils." Now, if you know your ancient Pythagoreanism, you'll know that what it was perhaps most associated with was living according to a quote-unquote Pythagorean way of life, which included very famously and uniquely the abhorrence and avoiding of fava beans. If Al-Kindi's account is to be trusted here, it seems that the Haranians might have been a late follower of this old tradition. So they certainly saw themselves as standing in a long lineage of sages like Hermes, Pythagoras, Plato, and others, tracing their tradition back to ancient times. But at the end of the day, this wasn't very special or unique, was it? This could be said for most cultures or traditions that had been part of the wider Roman Hellenic sphere, and doesn't really indicate any special Hermetist character for the Haranians. Now, as a counter-argument to this, there is some evidence that they had books attributed to Hermes as part of their wider canon. In the Fihrist, at the end of the section on Al-Kindi's account, it says, quote, "Al-Kindi said that he examined a book which that people, the Haranians, regard as authoritative. It is Chapters of Hermes on the Doctrine of God's Unity, which he wrote for his son most expertly on God's unity. Philosophers who have exerted themselves will find no alternative to them and to professing their doctrine." And scholars like Kevin van Bladel seems to indicate that, or argue, or speculate maybe, that this book that's mentioned here might be a part of the Corpus Hermeticum, but this is hard to know for sure. This is intriguing evidence and points even more strongly to the point that we've already made, without necessarily proving that they were Hermetists in the more narrow and specific sense. I think it might be good here to get an overview of the role of Hermes in Islam to sort of better understand what's actually going on. So by the 8th century, probably a lot earlier, the figure of Hermes, Trismegistus, had become identified with the biblical patriarch Enoch. Now, Enoch is of course mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and it's described as being taken by God. That's kind of all it says. It doesn't really tell us much about Enoch at all. But of course, later on in history, there developed this huge literature dedicated to Enoch and talking about this ascent. So they interpreted this as God taking him up to the heavens. He sort of ascends to the heavens. He's taught all these esoteric divine secrets by the angels. In some traditions, he even becomes an angel, Metatron himself. In other accounts, he sort of returns back to earth and becomes a kind of prophetic figure. So this identification happens quite early in late antiquity. And also in Islam, very early, in the very earliest days of Islam, we see scholars, Islamic scholars, identify the Quranic prophet Idris. So there's a prophet in the Quran called Idris, also doesn't say very much about Idris in the Quran, but he becomes identified with Enoch. So just like Enoch is taken by God in the Qur'an, it says that Idris was raised to a lofty station. This sounds similar to the way that Enoch is described, especially in the post-biblical literature as well. And so because of this, naturally, of course, the Muslim scholars also identified Idris, the prophet, with Hermes. So Idris in Islam, Idris is Enoch, is Hermes. And this is very significant because it gives the figure of Hermes a legitimacy within the Quranic narrative of the prophets and the dispensation of revelation across history. It seems to have been conceived, this idea of identifying Idris with Hermes, quite early on, as I said, maybe in the 8th century, but it becomes very firmly sort of established in the writings of Abu Ma'shar. Abu Ma'shar was a 9th century figure associated with Al-Kindi, who was an astronomer and scientist and all-around polymath in that same environment of Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. And he writes works where he very much establishes Hermes as Idris, as this prophetic figure. There are many other aspects of Hermes in Islam and his role in Islam that's quite interesting. For example, even in Abu Ma'shar, it's clear that they conceived of 3 distinct Hermeses historically. There were 3 different Hermeses, 2 before the flood and 1 after the flood. But anyway, this is beyond the scope of this particular episode. But what's important to remember here and keep in mind is that through this identification of Hermes with Idris, Hermes was now seen by many scholars, Muslims generally, as being among the great prophets sent by God in history. And this is very significant. And he specifically becomes a symbol, a representative, or sort of originator of astronomical, astrological, and esoteric occult sciences and natural sciences more generally, which were seen as kind of the same back then. Probably because of the Enochic lore about him being brought up to heaven to converse with angels and given special divine knowledge, this became widely accepted lore about Idris/Hermes. All true and legitimate knowledge is divinely revealed, and the science of astronomy and talismans and other natural sciences were revealed by God to Hermes in particular. This story thus gives a divine justification for many of the philosophical fields that Muslim scholars were engaged in at that time. The Arabic text called Kitab al-Tufaha, the Book of the Apple, possibly composed in the 10th century, says, quote, there's a dialogue where Diogenes says, "Whence did the philosophers arrive at this view?" The sage answered, "The preachers of the ages have always preached this up to the horizons of the earth. The first of the people of our land to whom this science was revealed was Hermes." Diogenes asked, "Whence did it come to Hermes?" The sage answered, "He ascended in his spirit into heaven and heard it from the heavenly host who took it from the noble record. Then he returned to the earth and the sages learned it from him." Diogenes said, "How do I know that he took it from the inhabitants of heaven?" The sage answered, "If this matter is the truth, then its advent was from on high." In other words, the attribution of Hermes as the quote-unquote prophet of the Haranians makes sense within an Islamic framework as it existed back then. He was the prophetic originator of much philosophical knowledge. And later on in history, in an account by al-Mubashir ibn Fatik, who highlights Hermes and Idris precisely as the main prophet of the Sabians/Harranians, but presents him here in a much more classical Islamic way, as a law-giving prophet. So before, as we saw, Hermes/Idris was seen as this kind of esoteric sage who ascended to heavens and was given spiritual knowledge and then came back and revealed that knowledge to humankind. By this time, this is a bit later in the 11th century, we see that he has become firmly a part of this more standard kind of prophetic history of Islam. In this text, he's described very much as a kind of law-giving prophet, similar to Muhammad or Jesus and Moses and all these prophets, as opposed to this more esoteric sage. He's that too, of course, but it does tell you something that he is described in this way in these later texts. This is the quote. He, that is Hermes, preached God's judgment, deen, belief in God's unity, mankind's worship of God, and saving souls from punishment. He incited people to abstain piously from this world, to act justly, and to seek salvation in the next world. He commanded them to perform prayers that he stated for them in manners that he explained to them, and to fast on recognized days of each month, to undertake jihad against the enemies of their religion, and to give charity from their possessions, and to assist the weak with it. End quote. And so on. So it's definitely possible that the emphasis on Hermes as a prophet in this way, even putting aside the very clearly Islamic projecting account of Mubashir, could also be the result of assimilation to already existing Islamic doctrines. But it's also important to point out that this was an environment where different scholars, religious traditions, and philosophers influenced each other and were equally responsible for cross-pollination. Just as Haranian doctrines and ideas made their way into the Islamic intellectual sphere and influenced it, so did the Islamic framework probably affect the way that Haranians negotiated and understood their own tradition. Not just as a coping strategy, as we said before, but as a legitimate change and development within the tradition itself. Okay, so this episode is turning out to be a lot longer than I originally expected it to be, but there are a few more things that I think are worth talking about. Among them is the fact that what we do know about the Haranian religion, especially in terms of their practices and so on, is related to their calendar. And this also comes from the Fihrist of al-Nadim, where they describe the sort of yearly calendar of the Haranians and the different ceremonies and practices and rituals that take place at different points of the year. In the Fihrist, the most extensive overview of the customs and festivals of the Haranians come from a manuscript by a Christian writer called Abu Sa'id Wahb ibn Ibrahim. It goes through each month of the year and the different ceremonies, prayers, and practices that are performed on each of these months. And quickly it becomes clear that even here, the planets play a pretty important role, as many of the ceremonies are directed at different heavenly bodies at different times. The practices will often involve offerings in the form of animal sacrifice to these planets, often different periods of fasting and different prayers. Here's an example of how it can sound in an early section from the manuscript. Quote, on the 6th day of the month of April, they slay for their divinity the moon a bull, which they eat at the end of the day. On the 8th day, they fast and then break the fast with the meat of lamb. On this day, they also hold a feast in honor of the 7 deities, might be referring to the planets here, the devils, jinn, and spirits. They burn 7 lambs for the 7 deities, which are the devils. This indicates that the 7 deities are something else than the planets, but I digress. Now, one of the most recurring and mysterious themes mentioned in several places in this section is a ceremony that is referred to as the Mystery of the North. From the descriptions, this seems to be perhaps the most important ceremony that is performed sometimes several times a month. There are some indications that the cardinal direction of north had been important to them generally. Even in Al-Kindi's account from before, we got an indication of this. Quote, they have developed one direction for prayer, which they have fixed toward the North Star in its course. The intelligent thus seek to inquire for wisdom, end quote. And it also appears that, quote-unquote, the North is referring to a certain deity, maybe the highest deity in the pantheon in some way, assuming a more polytheistic leaning theme for their theology. But throughout the Fihrist account, one can also get the impression that the north can maybe refer to the sun, sometimes also the moon, and other places in this section also indicates that the sun was somehow the highest of the celestial gods. Quote, on the 9th of Shubat, they begin a 7-day fast, the first day of which is dedicated to the sun, the great Lord, the Lord of blessing. During these days, they eat no meat and drink no wine. During this month, moreover, they pray only to the north, the jinn, and the devils. End quote. This is interesting, right? Because as we saw before, the city of Haran was historically primarily associated with the moon god, Sin. There was a temple there to Sin historically. But it seems, if this account is to be trusted, that at some point over the course of this history, the sun might have taken on the more exalted role in this heavenly pantheon among the Haranians. And this is in fact supported also by Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed, in that quote that we mentioned earlier from him, where he talks about the Sabians and their planetary worship and specifically mentions the sun as being the sort of highest of these deities, however that is to be understood. But, in this pantheon of heavenly bodies that seem to have maybe the role of gods or deities to them, the sun might have been especially important, to have a sort of especially exalted role, at least at this point in history. What exactly this mystery to the north indicates is hard to say. Some scholars have wanted to see this as some form of mystery rite, but we don't really get any expanded discussions other than things such as those that were already mentioned: offerings, sacrifices, praying, fasting, and so on. Now, one account that stands out a little bit more than the others is this one, quote, "On the 27th day of August, they perform the worship of the mystery of the north, for the deity who makes the arrow fly. On this day also, they set up a table on which they place 7 portions for the 7 deities and the north." Interesting here that it's the 7 deities and the north, indicating that it's separate from them somehow. Anyway, the priest brings a bow, which he strings, and into which he fixes an arrow to which there is attached a firebrand. It has a flame at its head and is made of wood which grows in the region of Haran. On it there is a piece of cloth upon which the flame is ignited, just as it lights a candle. The priest shoots 12 arrows. Then the priest walks as a dog does on his hands and feet until he fetches the arrows. He does this 15 times and then makes an augury. That is, he divines that if the firebrand is extinguished, the feast in his estimation is not acceptable, but if it is not put out, then the feast is accepted. End quote. We also get mention of the Sabians and their rites in the epistles of the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan Safa, and in the famous Ghayat al-Hakim, the sort of grimoire that's known by its Latin name, the Picatrix, and both of these sources seem to describe a kind of elaborate ritual of initiation that the young members of the Haranian culture had to go through. It also became very common in these kinds of sources to attribute to the Haranians more active methods of honing the powers of these heavenly bodies. It was not merely a system of revering the planets and stars, but also where their power could be used to make talismans and thus affect things in this world. In this way, many have pointed to the Sabians of Harran as originators, or at least an important source for occult sciences entering the Islamic world. This also, of course, makes sense given their connection with Hermes, who himself was very directly associated precisely with these kinds of sciences and wisdoms. Keep in mind, though, that these claims and the sources that we have been looking at here as descriptions of Haranian practice have several problems, and it's hard to know how much of it we can deem trustworthy. Especially these latter features of talismanic magic and other occult practices, we simply lack clear evidence to say with certainty if there is even such a connection to begin with. In any case, that's kind of the extent of what we can say about the Haranian religion. And even then, the sources that we've been using to say and to come to these very conservative conclusions are themselves sometimes questionable, right? So everything that we say is very uncertain. And indeed, as I said before, this episode is a lot longer than I thought it would be. Because there is a lot to say, obviously. There's a lot we can say, and it's interesting to talk about all these possibilities, but all of it remains very unclear and uncertain in different ways. But I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't bring up another very fascinating aspect of the Haranians, and maybe particularly scholarship about the Haranians, namely their possible connection to the philosophical school of Neoplatonism. One of the most famous accounts of the Haranians come from the 10th century writer and historian al-Mas'udi. He says, quote, "This community, known as the Haranians and the Sabians, has philosophers. However, they are some of the common riffraff of the philosophers, differing from the elite sages in their doctrines. I consider them philosophers only by way of lineage, not by way of wisdom, because they are Hellenes, Yunaniya. This, again, as I said in my last video, this means pagans, basically, at this time. Not all of the Hellenes are philosophers, only their sages are the philosophers. And then this section, which is interesting. I saw on the door knocker of the gathering place of the Sabians in Harran a saying of Plato, written in Syriac, of which Malik ibn Uqbun and others of them informed me of the interpretation. It is, he who knows his essence becomes divine. And in Arabic, this is given as man arafa dhatuhu ta'alluhu. Plato has said, man is a heavenly plant. The indication of it is that he is like an inverted tree. Its roots are toward heaven, and its branches are toward the earth. Al-Mas'udi gives us some interesting information here. He calls them Yunaniya, indicating that they were pagan or polytheists in some way, and describes a temple, a gathering place. But it is how he connects them with philosophy that is especially interesting. Not only does he claim that there are many philosophers there, although he doesn't think they're legitimate philosophers, clearly, but also that there is this supported quote from Plato on the temple door, thus connecting them specifically with the Platonic tradition. And this would become another one of the most famous and most speculated about aspects of Haranian culture. Much of this, of course, connects to what we have already discussed, and many have used this quote to indicate that Haran was a special place for philosophical activity, especially for the Platonist school. And when we take into consideration the career of Thabit ibn Qurra, who would come to represent the Haranians in Baghdad as a great philosopher and scholar, he will often be seen as evidence of this philosophical tradition that existed there. But there are many problems with the way that this is often portrayed and talked about. In fact, many of the assumptions that the medieval Arab writers, and indeed many still today, have about the Haranians is information or characteristics filtered through Thabit and scholars like him. This is something that the Swedish scholar of religions Jan Hjärpe has shown in his 1972 dissertation, where we assume, for example, that the Haranians must have been very philosophical or be great scholars because someone like Thabit came from there. But it does betray a certain tendency that people have to look at Haran as a source of ancient philosophical wisdom that had been preserved. In fact, there's been quite a fascinating theory popular among many scholars that posits Haran precisely as a hotbed for Neoplatonic philosophy and spirituality. This idea, as argued by scholars like Michel Tardieu and Pierre Ardon in the 1980s and 90s, is that there is a direct connection between the Haranians and the Neoplatonic school of Athens. You see, the Athenian Academy, which was the center for Neoplatonic learning in late antiquity, was closed by the Emperor Justinian in 529. This was the place where great scholars like Proclus had been teaching their Neoplatonism at the time. And by the time of its closing, the scholarchs and leaders of the school, such as Damascus and Simplicius, were forbidden from teaching and essentially forced to flee the Roman Empire. They thus instead went to Sasanian Persia and were protected there under the rule of Khusro. Then, a few years later, the story goes, there was an agreement between the Sasanian king and the Roman emperor that, among other things, allowed the philosophers to return to settle in the Roman Empire again. And no one really knows where they did, if this is even true. But the theory is that they settled in, you guessed it, Haran. Haran would have thus become the heir to the Athenian Academy, the center for Neoplatonic philosophy and mysticism in late antiquity, perhaps marrying this with the already existing polytheistic and perhaps astrological religion that existed there. One of the popular pieces of evidence for this is, of course, also that quote from al-Mas'udi that we mentioned earlier, where he claims not only that Haran was full of philosophers, as he said, but also that it had that fascinating quote from Plato on one of its temples. This is obviously a very intriguing theory and one that would be very convenient in a number of ways. It's also just very juicy from a sort of esoteric mysterious history perspective, which is nice. It would very easily and conveniently explain how Neoplatonic text and Neoplatonic ideas and learning was transmitted to the early Arab and Muslim writers, right? Because we have this direct lineage from the Athenian Academy who went to Haran, and then the Haranians went to Baghdad, and we have solved this historical mystery, right? That's very convenient. And one way that scholars like Tardieu have talked about this or explained this is to posit that there has to have been two kind of classes or groups within the wider Haranian milieu or environment. One sort of elite group of philosophers that represents this direct lineage from the Neoplatonists, and then the sort of common riffraff of regular polytheists who worshipped as they always had. This goes back originally to the Swedish scholar Jan Hjärpe in his dissertation, who argued in a more conservative sense for the idea that the Haranians in Baghdad, like Thabit, they represent a kind of special group of Haranians that don't necessarily represent the way that things worked back in Haran, right? So Thabit and his family and his associates in Baghdad, it is through them that we know the Haranians. Haranian knowledge is filtered through them and their philosophers and scholars, and so there must have existed this kind of Baghdadian strand of Haranians or Sabians, but back in Haran things were maybe different, and these are two different groups. What Tardieu does with this is he takes it even further by arguing that there must have existed this distinction between these two groups even within Haran itself. So that in Haran, there would have been the regular people, the polytheists who went to the temples and so on, just the common people, and then sort of an elite group of esoteric philosophers of the Neoplatonist school, and mystics maybe, if you want to use that word. But this wider theory is actually largely rejected today in scholarship. Scholars like Kevin van Bladel have argued and shown that there simply isn't any evidence for this. It simply requires too much assumption and wishful thinking to make it work. As convenient as it would be, it simply isn't supported in the sources enough. Certainly, as we said with Hermetism, the Haranians would have been exposed to and influenced by the school of Neoplatonism, which was a dominant school of philosophy in the late antique Hellenic and Roman sphere and beyond, but this doesn't make them any more unique than many other places in that region, aside from the fact that they survived for that long, obviously. There is really no evidence for the idea that Haran was a kind of center for this philosophy, or that it was a place for the continuation of this school in the way presented by Tardieu and others. The fact that Plato is possibly quoted on one of their temples is completely expected and within the bounds of possibility, since they revered those old philosophical sages just like most others in that cultural sphere. But it does not in any way prove that there was a specific Neoplatonic school there. So this is the conservative amount of things that we can say about this religious tradition. They were probably connected in some way to the older Mesopotamian religion. All sources seem to indicate that the heavenly bodies were a central part of their worldview, whether as mediaries or divinities themselves. They also saw Hermes and other ancient sages like Pythagoras and Plato as important inspirational figures, and they might have had a complex calendar of rituals and ceremonies dedicated to the god or gods, involving sacrifices, fasting, and maybe daily prayers. And even that is kind of assuming a lot of these descriptions are valid to begin with. Regardless, it's certainly true that they made a name for themselves in the great places of learning in the Islamic world, so that they became quite famous. Thabit ibn Qurra and his family continued to be close to the Abbasid court. His son Sinan would walk in his father's footsteps and establish a lineage of Haranian scholars in Baghdad close to the court and scholarly elite for centuries afterwards. They were respected by the people around them, even though there were occasionally some tensions regarding their religious adherence, but it indeed appears that it wasn't until the 11th century that the last member of Thabit's descendants finally converted to Islam, thus ending the Baghdadi side of the Sabian lineage. In the city of Haran itself, a similar situation seemed to have taken place. They continued to practice their religion up until the 11th century, when the city was under the rule of the Nomaid dynasty. This was a time of great political instability, as the region was in the middle of several power struggles between Byzantine, Fatimid, Abbasid, and other forces. By the end of the 11th century, this political turmoil and accompanying religious intolerance caused much of the population to either flee and/or convert to Islam. The temples were destroyed or repurposed, and the old Haranian religion faded into history. Another final fatal blow, of course, came with the Mongol invasions and the destructive nature of that event as well. We are thus left with a historical curiosity rather than a religious community that still survives today. For this reason, we have to rely on second-hand reports from various places and sources, making it harder to know things with certainty about this mysterious religion of the ancient and early medieval world. But there's no doubt that they played an important and significant role in the cultural, intellectual, and religious environment of the Middle East. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope this was an interesting dive into this mysterious ancient and medieval group of maybe star worshippers or whatever was the deal with them. This was a lot of fun to research and make, so I hope you enjoyed it as well. I want to remind everyone that I just recently released a new single, a new song with my project Zini. It's called Tasting, and it's a kind of alternative rock-oriented song with influences from instruments and styles from the Middle East and global South. So if you're into that, then go check that out. I will leave links to that in my link tree in the description. You can also find it on my other channel. I want to thank all my patrons who support this channel monetarily, and without whom none of this would be possible. So I, as always, am deeply, deeply grateful and thankful for your support. If you want to follow me, you can find me on my socials, on Instagram and TikTok. You can also become a patron by following the link to my Patreon page. It's also in the description. And you can also find my other channel, Philip Holm, which is dedicated to my music, both, again, my own music, posting my music, but also talking about music. If you're interested in knowing about music in the way that I talk about religion here, maybe I'll make an episode on the music of the Haranian Sabians. Probably not much to say about that. But anyway, that kind of content can be found over there. So go subscribe to that channel and check some of those videos out if you're interested. Thank you so much again for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.